So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name's Liberty and I'm part of the Firestorm Collective. We're excited to host this discussion with two authors who we love, Scott Branson and Vicky Osterweil. We'll be discussing Scott's latest book, Practical Anarchism, A Guide to Daily Life. Yes, yep. Awesome, on cue. Just came out last week from Pluto Press, so that's pretty exciting. I think possibly we're the first. Are we the first event for this book?
Yeah, definitely.
Pretty great. Okay. So Firestorm, in case you didn't know, is a 14-year-old radical bookstore owned and operated by a queer feminist collective in Southern Appalachia on Chalagi land. We strive to feature books and events that reflect our interests and the needs of marginalized communities in the South. We're also continuing to do events like this one online, both because we love reaching people outside our region, but also because we know that a lot of people we love and care about are still being negatively impacted by COVID. So in the next month or so, we'll be doing a bunch of events that you should check out, including events on ecological revolution, anti-fascist subcultures, and indigenous world building. So if you're interested in signing up for future events, I'm just gonna drop links in the chat there for you. You can check it all out on our calendar. So if you made it here tonight, you probably know that we are using Zoom. There is a Q&A tool that we're going to make use of, and you can find that at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a phone, I have no idea. Good luck. And that Q&A tool will allow you to submit a question. I don't know, you could use it, make a comment. It seems like most questions end up being comments anyway. And we will do our best to address the good questions. So without further ado, we're going to get going here. We've got Scott Branson and Vicky Osterweil. Scott is a queer and trans writer, translator, teacher, artist, and anarchist organizer, allegedly living in Western North Carolina. They translated Gay Liberation after May 68, as well as The Abolition of Prison, and co-edited a forthcoming volume titled Surviving the Future, Abolitionist Queer Strategies, which I think is PM Press. Is that right? Cool.
Yes.
Yeah, be on the lookout for that one. They're also a frequent co-host on the anarchist podcast, The Final Straw. And I'm pretty sure you can find a previous conversation with Scott on our YouTube channel. Vicky Osterweil is a writer, editor, and agitator, and a regular contributor to The New Inquiry. Her book, In Defense of Looting, A Riotous History. Oh, wait a second. Oh, there we go. Was released in 2020 by Bold Type Books. Her writing has also appeared in The Baffler, The Nation, The Rumpus, Real Life, and Al Jazeera America. And I would definitely recommend our 2020 conversation with Vicky and two other fantastic authors on the occasion of the publication of the last book. And that is also on our YouTube channel.
Fun fact, the publisher of the book put the Rumpus in my bio. I have never written for them. I don't even know what they are.
It's canonical.
I've kept it there forever. Yeah,
yep,
I love it.
Every time I get to, are a Rumpus writer.
I'm a Rumpus writer, so enjoy that, everybody.
Pretty sure it's in your Wikipedia bio. Definitely canon.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So friends, welcome. I'm going to pass it to Scott, who's going to introduce the book for us tonight, but I'm really looking forward to it.
Thanks, Liberty. I'm so happy to do this first book launch event at Firestorm, which is been sort of a home for me for the last number of years. And I'm also really excited to be doing this in conversation with Vicky Osterweil, who's someone I really admire and have learned a lot from. And if you read the book, I even quote Vicky in the book. Yeah, I thought I would just say a few things about what I was trying to do with the book, and then we can have a conversation. So coming into the book, there's the way I was thinking, and also the way that it was sort of presented as a project to Pluto Press, was to think about anarchism beyond the kind of associations that we have in the press with riots or black bloc direct action simply, or just the kind of dismissal of anarchism as impossible, a categorical rejection of it as something that's adolescent, that you grow out of. And in the book, I wanted to look at where anarchism might already exist, so that we can start thinking about how we can multiply those spaces and those times of anarchistic living. One major assumption in the book is that we're made to believe things must be this way, the way that they are, which is horrible, which makes us blind to how they aren't actually that way all the time, right? There's all these places that we all haven't been kind of totalized in the schema of capital and the state. One of the images I use in the book is this idea of a kaleidoscope shift. And that's sort of what I'm hoping to propose in the book, is that you could change your perspective. I'm using a lot of visual metaphors here, which have some problems, but I like the image of the kaleidoscope shift of just like kind of turning something and you're like, oh, like this alters the world, right? It falls into place differently. There's all these pieces and I can put them together in another way. One of the major sort of thrusts of the book is to root out the state logics that are in our head. By that, one of the things I think we really internalized is naturalized hierarchy as a biological fact, by which I mean like racism, misogyny, compulsory heterosexuality, all these kinds of hierarchies that classify people and organize them. And we assume that that is how people should be. But this is, actually a long history of forcing people to be dependent on the state and the market, of intervening in their lives and forcing them to work too, to survive. One of the ways that I see this just sort of in daily life now is that we kind of will feel like we need someone to intervene when we have problems, right? Like to go to an authority, looking for others to solve those problems. It becomes a kind of generalized police function where we want to defer to someone else. I mean, I see this also just like in anarchist organizing, right? Like we do a book fair and there's a problem and they're like, where are the organizers? They need to do something about this, right? Rather than people handling them themselves. This generalized police function, I like Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls it like a guard duty. Like people are just kind of like there policing each other when they don't even need to be. One of the things I want to look at in the book is how we can learn, from our close relationships, how to better understand our boundaries and our needs, and then bring this to the world at large and find from that ways to promote, mutual freedom. The other thing in this, I'm proposing an idea of anarchism that has a different understanding of revolution. I know people who've been involved in street actions or other kinds of protests, or just like looking at the uprisings that have happened over the last decade, we can see there's like a punctual event and then there's like, well, what happens afterwards? Things don't seem to change, right? But something does happen during that moment. And so people who have involved in that know that there's something like life, like this is what life should be, right? That you kind of grasp. This is also, I think, like what happens after is why a lot of people don't trust anarchists in leftist organizing, because other groups want to recreate the state either through their idea of a revolution, which is blueprinted, or some kind of gradualism, like electing the right people. They pose as the adults versus us, the anarchists that are adolescents, which is another power system that I think is operative in our world, that kids are, not to be listened to. So the book is trying to think about how do we tap into that kind of moment of connection that happens in protests in our daily lives and find resources there. The book is asking us to look into the work we do to care for one another. So I'm trying to offer like an anarchist take on what Marxist feminists call social reproduction, which is the work that's mostly unpaid or devalued, that goes into reproducing social forces the way they are. But I'm pulling from some decolonial feminist ideas of like, we're implicated in this work, right? We're not simply produced by it. And so therefore we can like think about altering the society that we're creating through the care that we give to each other, right? We need to destroy this world and produce a different society. We don't want to be like kind of impressed into this work of social reproduction. So the book isn't written for after some kind of hypothetical revolution, but for right now, and to think about ways that we can repurpose our daily life, the ways that we are forced to commit our time alongside the joys and luxuries that we do snatch from that. Thinking about how we can take that time away from serving the system to find resources that already exist, right? And that we can steal. So again, just we know that moment of feeling connected, and we need to find ways to reproduce it. but we can't make it this, the anarchist idea, I think, proposes that it's not like that we'll reach a place where this is continuous, right? Perpetual, but it's something that we keep having to do, right? We keep having to figure out. So yeah, I think that's sort of probably a good overview of what I'm trying to do in the book. I'll stop there and kind of open to our conversation.
Yeah, I'll jump in and just say that I think the format of the book is really inviting. In my reading of it, I really appreciated that it doesn't feel surface level, but it also doesn't take anything for granted. Like, you do a really great job of introducing a lot of ideas and people, but you kind of always like provide the groundwork for the reader. So I think it's a very like kind of newbie accessible title in some ways, which is always great. I mean, and I also love, you do some interesting things that I don't see very often, like kind of you have like FAQs at the end of each section, which I thought was really cute. I guess the book has the word guide in the title, and I guess I'm curious, is this to what extent is this a guide? Will it tell people how to do anarchy?
I mean, I think the word can be accurate, but I don't mean guide as a prescriptive thing, because I don't think anarchism can be prescriptive if you're doing it like, in its spirit or whatever. But it's rather kind of like preparing a disposition. So like the book is a preparation for like taking on a different attitude to life. And I break it down into these fundamental elements of the way many people are forced to live under the current conditions. So each chapter proposes in those conditions, like relationships or work or money or whatever, like ways to rethink the way that you live outside of these structures, or inside and outside, right? Like not imagining that you can just escape them. So for example, you have to work, but you can find ways that you don't identify with your job, right? We're kind of like told that we are what we do, or we have aspirations to have a career, but rather like think about our employment, right? If we have that as a way to gain access to resources and then share those resources. Or similarly, I talk about money, and you can, whoa, a door just like ghostly opened right next to me. That was weird. Money, take the morality out of our relationship to money in that situation, rethink the orientation to a future that capitalism makes us like save, and like we have to save for something, but that future's kind of been sold out from under us, and think about how we live under now the purported future, right? So yeah, just like thinking about, it's not like a step-by-step guide, but a way of like rethinking your attitude towards the things that determine your life.
Yeah, I was struck just building from that, Liberty, like I have been actually I think both of y'all have been in the struggle sort of similarly. We're sort of in this very strange activist space. We're like old heads in our 30s or whatever, but but anyway, I don't actually know what y'all's age is, so I apologize. But I guess like what I'm trying to say is that I found it really like inspirational and productive for me, and like on a par with a lot of stuff that I really liked. Like you talk about the situation as you talk about Guy Debord in your art section, which is a good place to talk about him. But I think like there's sort of critiques of everyday life. Raoul van Eigen's work on that, although I haven't revisited that in a long time. Also, and people say he's a creep, so I imagine that might be true. And I haven't read it. Sorry, everyone, if that's the case. But like also Larry Mitchell, the faggots and their friends between revolutions. But all of that was like sort of making me think about like, there is this sort of very clear, and as Liberty said, very welcoming, open, sort of accessible space too. Like, did you have a particular audience in mind? I also note that at the end, you sort of like say, maybe you still don't want to use the word anarchism, but maybe you can do some of these practices. So like, was the sense that you were writing to someone who would be picking it up, sort of being like, I don't know what this is about, or were you just sort of, did you have an idea in mind, seeing as it's such a practical handbook sort of type style?
Yeah, I mean, that clearly, like, yeah, I'm trying to get people into it, which is also, I mean, a major issue in anarchism, right? To like, how do we get people in? And I talk about that a little bit too, because a lot of the entry points are really gate-kept or feel unapproachable, because you go in through different subcultures, whether it's like punk or just various radical queer subcultures. So finding a way to get people into it. And I've taught stuff before, like taught science fiction, where I'm really teaching anarchism, and then all my students are like, oh, I'm an anarchist. I didn't really realize that. So I kind of wanted to like create that situation for people who hadn't pull in the anarcho-curious or whatever. But also I was hoping that I could make a contribution to like people who are already immersed in some version of anarchism. Like I'm not trying to write like the authoritative take on it, but I'm in conversation with like a lot of different people that I like, and I wanted to add some stuff to anarchism that I've taken from other things that don't call themselves anarchists, which for me, like, yeah, I don't care if you call yourself an anarchist in the end, it doesn't really matter. I use the word strategically for myself. And I think it means something, but people do a lot of things that I would call anarchism without using that name. So yeah, the audience, I wanted to like have someone like you, Vicky, and Liberty, like take something out of the book, but also have it be accessible to anyone who hadn't thought about this before.
Yeah, no, that's really great. And I think like, yeah, I think there is a real problem. There's two real problems, I think, one of which I think you're right. The more annoying one is the gatekeeping, the necessity of entering a subculture and a space. This is often also very racialized, although it tends to be much more queer than other activist spaces. But I think like, yeah, I think sort of maybe transitioning into some of the theory that you're doing as well, though, like one of the other things that's harder that I think is a strength of anarchism is that my cat is interrupting constantly. One of the strengths I think is that like we don't build stuff to last in a real permanent party form, organizational kind of way. And I've often been in conversations where people are frustrated by this, and there are things that are very frustrating about that. And I think I really liked how you frame sort of one of the tasks of anarchism being able to break up well, and being able to
You got muted, Vicky.
She had it. She was done with my comments. She was like, shut up and pet me. Love that. Once she destroyed my computer, so the muting is like pretty mellow as far as things she's done. But yeah, I think oh yeah, Scott, now Scott's frozen, I think. I'll come back maybe. Anyway, maybe it's just on my end. But yeah, I think like the question of breaking up and the question of disidentification of sort of a space that sort of will dissolve. And I think one of the things that I was thinking about a lot during your book, and then I'm going to bounce it to you to explain those concepts, because I think that's really exciting. I think the way you do it's really exciting. But one of the things that I think about a lot is that as a result, a lot of people, when they get radicalized, they end up in organizations that have been formed specifically to catch people when there isn't a social movement ongoing. And it's not necessarily the fault of those organizations. It's not even an ideological problem of those organizations, although often it is, but structurally, those organizations are necessarily built to maintain in a period of, proletarian dormancy, right? Or like sort of stagnation and lack of movement. And as a result, the vast majority of them, when things explode in the streets, will have developed politics and strategies and ideology that are small c conservative in the face of the revolution. They won't be willing to dash everything on the rocks of the uprising, right? They're not willing to smash their organization to pieces, trying to accelerate things. They'll tend to try to protect, hold, maybe gain strength and grow in size. All of which is to say, another big, I think, problem for people entering into anarchism, she knocked the mouse off the table, thank you so much, is I guess it's a mouse, she's a cat, is that like sort of this lack of permanence. And so I want to like think through how you think about disidentification and breaking up as sort of these core ideas and forms, and what that how that informs sort of organizational practice, and how that maybe at the next level of the question, although I describing those would be great, how that interacts with organizing, welcoming people in, making spaces where we can practice disidentification together.
Yeah. Well, so one of the reasons, well, okay, yeah, one of the things that I think anarchism can bring to our relationship to like what we call politics is a critique of that phenomenon that you're talking about, which is like the way that parties kind of step in to make us feel like, often they make us feel like we're doing things when we're not really doing anything, whether it's like, liberal or socialist or some kind of Marxist formation. The party structure makes us think that we're involved. And I think that can really kind of take our efforts out of like other aspects. And usually also because this mindset tends to think either it has some kind of like glorious nostalgic idea of a revolution that's not anywhere near to happening, alongside, actually, I guess it's not either or, it's like that plus we need to be involved in like elections, right? Basically, in some way, right? Like the kind of Jacobin leftism or something. And so I think that, like, I don't know, we've seen the failure of that. We've seen that doesn't, I mean, you can get some little gains, and I'm not saying that people shouldn't do that or like work for policy changes or whatever, but to encapsulate your whole involvement in the world and politics through this kind of idea and everything else, it doesn't matter, really leaves aside the whole aspect of like where we're actually living and what we're actually doing. So like, that's why I want to say that anarchism has a strength in that it doesn't try to build these perpetual structures. I mean, it does, people do try to do that, but it doesn't work because things change, right? And like anarchism, in the way that I try to theorize it, is something that is not continuous, right? It has to have a theory of change and involved in it, right? Like that and I pulled this a lot from like Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed, right? Because in that anarchist world on Anaris, we see that like this so-called anarchist society has kind of frozen and power has adhered in certain centers that stops people from being rebellious or changing things, right? So like when you set up a structure that can't be changed, it won't be unless someone does another revolution, right? So that I think also is like part of a sort of like the kind of building block of anarchist organizing, if you think about it in terms of like consensus and affinity groups. So like affinity groups offer a really flexible way of coming together to say, we're going to do this project because we share these values, and like we're not going to necessarily outlast this as a group, the project or whatever we're trying to get. And consensus, the way that I think it should be used, not always the way it actually is used, is to say like, well, if I'm in this group and all of these people are saying that they want to do this and I don't want to do that, then I'm in the wrong group, right? Like I should get out of that group. Not like hold everyone up and say they can't do it because I have some principle that they need to follow, right? It's a way to allow yourself to like reform different kinds of groups around what you actually want to get done. And I think if you like, one of the problems that people kind of critique about anarchism or just any kind of revolutionary politics is the idea of scale. I think that actually helps us rethink the idea of scale, because whatever forms that we create, we want to have them be flexible and changing and not stay the same. Now, I don't know if that gets into the question of like gatekeeping or like entry points. I mean, maybe that's a way to seem, so people want the like program, and that's why like the ISO or whatever is like, or PSL seems compelling, those different kinds of socialist groups or ML groups. But also maybe that idea that there's like something new that you're part of it can be exciting too. And that's something I've seen over the last number of years, is that there's like all these new people coming into things. And so rather than being like, you're entering this like, pre-established zone and you have a place in it, you can have a hand in what you're doing. I mean, that could be a good way to think about it.
Yeah, and I just like, just to build on that before we get like more to the sort of more theoretical sort of disidentification question. If you look at the history, I mean, I think people tend to look at the history of sort of the Bolshevik Party or the Communist Party in terms of like the year 1917, when there's sort of like, there's this series of slogans that like brings them to power or whatever. But if you read social histories of the period when political parties were effective as mass organizational forms, which arguably they kind of still are in India, but most of the world, they're no longer like really functional that way. The mass party was a way of life. Like if you read about, part of what the betrayal of Stalinism was for members of communist parties outside of Russia was that the CP was sort of a whole life. They had concerts, and this is also true, the Wobblies or other anarchist and union formations, like in the 19th century. If you look at how they organized, actually, like it's mostly social organizing, right? Like maybe if you work in a particular iron plant, maybe you do 1 or 2 strikes in a decade, right? But like most of the sort of unionizing and other work that you're doing involves a lot of cultural practice, a lot of sort of socializing, what you described sort of as mutual aid and world building and life building. And like one thing that the 20th century sort of did was like successfully sort of divorce the political from that mode of everyday life. And so an appeal of the communist parties in the 20th century was that they resutured those together, right? Like if you joined the party, there was money, there was funding, there was organization for you to have a lot of friends, right? But then the nature of the CPs was that if you didn't follow the party line, you got excommunicated and you lost an entire life. And it's this mass trauma for a whole generation of radicals, right? Neither here nor there. Read Doris Lessing's novels. They're really good on that if you like to learn things novelistically. So I think like what I'm interested in is the focus that you have in the book on disidentification and breaking up. I think is really interesting in terms of like thinking through the goal of an organization, because I think part of that betrayal of those life forms was because people went in with the idea, we're going to march forward and forward and forward until we overthrow the capitalist state and produce the workers' utopia, whatever, which like sounds good. But like when it didn't happen, it was really traumatic. And I think like, how do you think, first of all, what does disidentification mean as a concept for people who aren't familiar? And how do you think orienting yourself towards that can help both political, but also just everyday social practice, as though those are different?
Yeah, I mean, thanks also for bringing that history, because yeah, I mean, the way that I see also contemporary anarchist organizing or community building happening is that it does try to create those social situations, you know, and form connections so that when something happens, you know each other, right? And you can do things together. And so I think that's super important. I use the word disidentification sort of as a way to think about, with each chapter, kind of frame, like this is the way that we are kind of told that we have to relate to these things, like relationships, you know, through a kind of aim of like, you know, eternal monogamy or whatever, and, you know, coupling rather than like valuing friendships or whatever. And work as a career or like the value of your like moral value, stuff like that, right? And like try to find a way to not take that stuff on and carve out a space to the side of it. So I mean, the word also has some theoretical valence, like the queer theorist Jose Esteban Munoz uses it in his book Cruising Utopia to talk about something that's like not simply like pro the system or a resistance to the system, where you can get caught in a kind of binary of like, you know, either you're the power or the thing against the power. But he theorizes it specifically in terms of Black and people of color finding ways to survive within the system that isn't wholly identifying with the power system, but isn't imagining that there's like some escape hatch. He does this reading of Vaginal Davis, which is really great. But yeah, so like disidentification as a kind of theory of like anarchism is to say like that there isn't this escape, we can't just wait for the revolution to like do the things that we want to do. We may not be marching in that progress that you said, like that kind of the Communist Party was promising, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing to do right now. And so like, yeah, I think like we kind of rethink what it means to be kind of to reframe our current daily lives, and not just be waiting for someone to save us.
Yeah, and you write in the book, you know, I think we've all had this experience in 2020. I think even me, you know, I am not exactly a particularly person with a lot of faith in systems. I've been surprised at how intensely naked the death drive and the lack of care around COVID has been. I've been impressed by how much they don't even care about hiding it, I think, is the thing that impresses me. I'm not confused that they did it, but I'm impressed that they're not even pretending when they're doing otherwise. Did you not do that? Thank you so much. And like I think like yeah, so like I think like there is this like not coming to save us is sort of a big thing, and like it makes me think about the concept that you talk about no place, which is obviously like a literal definition of utopia or translation of utopia, no place. but like I think like it comes on early and then you know you close on it. What do you like? How do you think of a sort of no place? How does this relate to the idea of not waiting? You know, the connection of time and space here, and about sort of like not being saved by anyone, not having somewhere to go where things will be good. How does that come together in the idea of no place, I guess, and utopia, you know?
Yeah. I mean, so this is something I think a lot about. I'm working on it. I'm collaborating with a couple friends on the sort of anarchist utopian thinking and its settler colonial ideas. And so, yeah, like utopia is totally, as an idea of like a better place, is completely connected with the European colonization of the Americas, or whatever we want to call them. And so, like, I don't want to kind of like just use that term uncritically. No place is, like you said, a literal translation. And I think that is one of the things I'm trying to think through in this book is that, okay, wait, this is a little sidestep, but like radical movements often get recuperated, right? And like taken into the dominant power system. We see that like with the George Floyd uprising, and then all the corporations did like, you know, Black voices or whatever, right? And like they try to sell it to you in some way. And I'm trying to think through the idea, like, are there places that we can keep outside of that capture from the power system? Are there places that already exist in our lives where we don't feel like we're dominated by the state or the market? And in a way, I think I'm shifting from an idea of space, like that we will have some place to go, to an idea of time, and that there are moments in our lives where we feel these things. And you know, that's something to like draw from, right? There's like moments of joy. It could be moments of grief too, but there are moments where we know that we aren't dominated by those things. And so I think it's really important for us to put our attention to the ways that we live that aren't, you know, just doing the work of the state, so that we know that we're doing it already. And then think about how we can, like, I don't know if I want to say like multiply them to totalize them or something like that, because I don't think that's possible. I think that we're always going to have problems. We're going to try things and fail. We need to experiment, but like just be aware that, you know, a lot of the sort of like academic theories of power seem so totalizing that there's no escape. And if that's true, then we can just pack it in right now. But it's not. Like we live lives with joy in them. And so just going back to the idea of breakup, I think this is important. Like I'm thinking about like boundaries, thinking about like our interpersonal relationships, where usually when people break up, it's hard and it sucks, but also afterwards people are like, that needed to happen, you know? And then you can like look at things and see like what was working and what wasn't. And we all like also kind of act out our horrible traumas on each other, even when we love each other. I think like thinking about the world in that kind of flexible way also lets us see that we don't succumb to the hopelessness of like how awful it is. I'm not saying that I have a way out either, but like there's some reason that there's some way to carve out some kind of survival, I think. Or at least as long as I'm living, I'm going to try.
Yeah, I really like that. I actually found that idea really provocative and exciting in terms of especially just the way I've been socialized and the way my gender works. I have a lot of trouble with boundaries and saying no to people, and I have a trouble like asserting myself and breaking up. And I think that's true of a lot of feminized people, and like a lot of people in general who have been trained to be workers. I mean, we all experience a lot of that. So I think like, but I also like that it is sort of connected with this idea of also a rebuilding, right? And I think like, and you touch on this, like a lot of abolitionists have framed abolition as like a mode of building and destroying, right? It's the end of the world, but it's also the building of a new one. And if it's just one or the other, it's not abolition, right? Like, and I think like that, so thinking through sort of like that question, you know, a lot of what this book focuses on, as we've been talking about, is everyday life. It's not political organizing, it's not labor organizing. You do talk about the workplace, but you talk about, you know, stuff that I think is just as interesting as organizing a union, if not more, in there, you know, around stealing time, goods, and giving people, you know, giving yourself space and freedom from having to define yourself by it, or, you know, whatever. So these other practices that aren't necessarily capital P political. So with all of that rambling things said, like how do you see sort of like a breaking up sort of model connected to this question of also like a kind of a focus on the social aspects of practice? Because I think when we think breakups and politics, it's really hard. We don't have any imaginary for that. Like breakup is a tragedy, right? Like the movement ends, right? The group dissolves, the like things split. These are all these like these are these moments of trauma, and they still can be even if the breakup's conscious. But like, you know, how can we think through that in a way that reorients our sense of political and social, which I think you do in the book, so I want you to do it, but do it for the fine people here now as well, is what I'm saying.
So how does the breakup like reorient our relationship to the social? I mean,
the social and the political, or we can talk about sort of, if you want to sort of move on from breakup, also we can just talk about sort of the social aspect. But
no, I mean, there's like, I have some thoughts here. I mean, I think I definitely think this is something that's like has gender all over it, right? And so some of the stuff that you were talking about, I'm thinking about like the way that I'm trying to inject, I don't know if that's the right word, infuse some feminist and queer radical thinking into it is through that kind of both like a questioning of the false distinction of like what is social and what's political, right? Like, which makes us think that the workplace is the place to, you know, to do political work because the work is like the revolutionary subject, which erases all of the other stuff that goes on. And that also didn't work, and it's not the conditions that we live in now. And we live in a world also now where like more people are reliant on care because we're like more and more disabled by capitalism and climate catastrophes. So shifting the location of where like revolutionary activity would be happening from the traditional ways that we see them. And this like also this played out like, you know, over 50 years ago with the gay liberation movement and the women's movement. They're like, this isn't it. This isn't enough. There was no place for us in those spaces. So we don't need to rehash that again. But so there's that, like the personal is political, or politics determines all the aspects of our life. But also I want to add a kind of anarchist skepticism of what politics even means, because that's like a language that's determined by the power system. And if we like wrap ourselves up in politics, it's just like, it's another form of consumption, it's another form of spectacle, going back to Debord, right? And like, and it tries, I think ultimately for the people who are interested in this stuff, it like puts a weight of importance on certain things and erases the importance of other things. And there, if we do that, we miss out on everything that's actually life. So that is part of like what I want to like rephrase the emphasis on. Now in terms of like breaking up, like, I mean, this, you can think about this also from like a kind of queer perspective. I mean, I'm sort of arguing that anarchism has to fail, right? And that kind of like queer art of failure way, but not to get lofty about it, like, it has to be experimental and like we have to try. So when we have to try and like fail and do it again. I think that we are so kind of over determined to look for lasting solutions, and when we look for that, we're actually gonna fail at the thing we want, which is like liberating everyone, because we just form another kind of state, whatever structure it is, even in the family, right? And so when we orient ourselves towards like our projects as not having to last forever, but things that would be provisional, then we know that we don't have to plug into them forever. We know that we can opt out, right? And like, I mean, you can go into a monogamous relationship, right? Knowing that you don't have to promise forever, that there is a way out, and then live a better relationship, right? Because you're like, I'm not stuck here, right? If you know that you're not stuck, you can have a long-term relationship being like, I'm choosing this rather than being forced to choose this. So I think that's another way that it can help. And then, you know, rather than look at the things that end as failures in the way, like a kind of capital F failure, but like rather as opportunities to like rethink and redo. I mean, that's really like anarchist practice, right? That like, okay, what did we do? You know, you do an action and then you're like, okay, now we have a debrief. maybe some people have to be held accountable for some things or whatever. There's like a lot of talking and processing about it. And then you're like, okay, now what? Now what do we do in the next time? You know, that is like, that work isn't like tangential to the action. You know, it's what makes us capable of doing bigger and better things too, I think.
I don't know if this is going to connect, and I might just have to transition to a totally different question. But one of the things that I was thinking about today, as I was thinking about the book, was, you know, about the way in which people point to the Russian Revolution as a success, the Communist Party as a success, the USSR as a success, and they're like, okay, the difference between that and the commune or your anarchist uprisings, whatever is success, and like in terms of like thinking about like, that's obviously that's making a moral claim about success, but like if that's a success, like that's a fucking nightmare, right? Like that's like the worst possible success I can imagine. And like actually I think the real difference in terms of failure between the Russian Revolution and other revolutionary moments or 20th century actually existing socialism is that we haven't yet accepted the failure, so it continues to fail. Whereas these other revolutions, like the commune, you know, you can look at it and you go, okay, it didn't work, they all died. But like we can think about what worked and succeeded in it. But because there are these people who are continuing to keep the Soviet Union alive in order that it keep failing us and keep destroying our liberatory movements, like even now, I mean, you know, first as tragedy, then as farce a bit now, but like, you know, it's still happening in the way in which that. So that's actually sort of a different orientation around success and failure than the one that you're arguing in the book and just now. But I think there is also this question. I think a lot of the turning to these state forms and these sort of permanent forms, and you know, like even Stalin, right? Like in I think has a lot to do with the rise of fascism and people being like, I'm scared. What worked in the past, right? And like if you glance for a second, you know, it's like, oh, that worked, you know, and then you convince yourself. You know, you spend all your time convincing yourself that in fact that did work, right? As a sort of form of political practice that's really just denial. And like I think like, yeah, sorry, this is like I'm rambling, but like I think like the left revolutionaries, whatever you want to call it, really haven't internalized the failure of the classical workers movement. And in this sense, I mean both the positive failure of it, the anarchistic failure of it, like the inspirational experimentation of it, but also its actual death as well, right? Like its actual end. Like you were saying, you know, these forms don't really exist anymore, right? Like in workplaces, and even when they did, they didn't work. So I think like thinking in terms of like history and time, I think is something that you talk about a lot in the book. And like I want to think about like maybe what I'm trying to build towards here is like how to read that kind of history. And maybe this is like a nerdy question that's not only for me. I don't know if it's really like super deep in the book, but how to read historical experience, both of people long dead, but also our own historical experience in a frame of breakup, dissolution, disidentification, that can be generative of future grasps at freedom. How do you see those things all sort of relating together, that sort of looking back at history through a lens of failure as a way of being able to like build a bigger, sexier failure next time?
Yeah, thanks. Well, yeah, okay, so you're right. I mean, the sort of failure success of the Russian Revolution is like still unprocessed. And then, you know, in the shadows of that is the French Revolution, which they were obsessed with too, right? And like it's like all of these rehashing of the same issues over and over again, which is like how to keep the revolution, how do you keep the revolution you know, pure to its assumed intentions, which is basically ends up having to kill a bunch of people, right, to do it, because people can't live that way. And that thing doesn't get solved. And then we ignore like the momentary successes of things like the Commune, right, or the Spanish Civil War,
or even February 1917, right? Like right. I think there's so much to learn from Russia in 1917 to 1921 that anarchists won't touch for obvious reasons, and they don't study that history. It's so important. Anyway, sorry, go on.
No, yeah, I mean, so for me, okay, so what do we do with this stuff? Like, in terms of reading history, like for me, it's the same thing as reading science fiction, which is like another thing we were talking about. Like, I think like science fiction, which shows you that the world doesn't have to be the way that it is, right? So it has that kind of future orientation, that there's a possibility for transformation. And then if you look at like histories, and I like kind of counter histories, or like the kind of, Linebaugh, Rediker, like history from below, it's like, it shows you that, first of all, there's like all these moments where it didn't have to be the way that it ended up, that there was a possibility, and that for a time it was lived like as real, and maybe it got crushed, but it doesn't have to be that way all the time. So also like, the Dixie Be Damned is a really good historical book that shows all these kind of resistance movements in the South where people were living in other ways, and it gets a lot of that stuff just gets erased from history too. So for me, they do the same thing to like allow us to imagine transformation as a possibility, even if it's like facing death. But that's what we are facing, right? Like, I don't know how soon it's going to come, but we do have this pandemic, which has brought a lot of death. And it totally makes sense to me for us to be like, well, I need the state to keep me safe, because first of all, it's like what we think the state is supposed to do, but even though it never does that, we have this idea that the state is there to take care of its like citizens, ration out care or whatever. But like, if we're gonna die because the state is gonna like relegate us to kind of disposability, then we might as well also risk something else, right? In some other moment. And we have to. It gets more and more dire every year, where like the timeline is shortening. So I think like reading these things for some kinds of inspiration that people have acted and done. This is actually, this just kind of like came up in my head. One of the things that I like about certain forms of like fiction is that it might not be prescriptive. Like I read Woman on the Edge of Time, which is this feminist utopian novel of a kind of anarchistic society. And there's things in that society I'm like, this would be really cool to live in. I would love to live in it. But the novel itself ends, it's like an allegory of someone taking an act, right? Like this woman who's incarcerated in a mental institution because of racist and misogynistic forces in her life. By the end of the book is like, I'm going to do something about this, and it doesn't necessarily work. We don't know what happens, but it doesn't necessarily work. But like the inspiration of the anarchist utopia allows her to act, and so I think that's one way to like kind of relate to the history and the fiction for me, is like to open up space where we think that we can actually do something to change the world that we live in.
Yeah, I want to throw in that, y'all are talking about kind of, I guess, like revolutionary moments that fail. And I think like we see this like even in less like sort of grand scale. Like I just think about in my time, in my, two and change decades of like anarchist organizing. I mean, we've got, how many waves of struggle have we seen like kind of crash? And I think this is like an experience that a lot of people have when they're new to things, is they have their first like moment of like revolutionary. I mean, I remember for me, it was like, it was Battle of Seattle. It was like heading out of that and being like, oh, this is it, we're going to win. And then of course we didn't win. And I think everybody does this, right? Like there's so many people that were in the streets in 2020 and we're like, this is it. We are going to win. The revolution is happening tomorrow. And then the revolution doesn't happen tomorrow. And so I guess this question of like breakups and kind of like how we navigate failure is so important to anarchism, just for practical reasons, because all of us are going to experience this over and over, and we lose a lot of people, right? Like every time there's a moment where tons of people are radicalized and in the streets, a lot of those people aren't prepared for that loss. And I've seen anarchists do a lot of work around this. Like I'm thinking, I don't know, nobody talks about these very often, but like there was a whole zine series that Crime Think did called After the Crest, I think, like in like 2014, maybe. Those were great. They were like kind of almost like case studies for like, how did anarchists like navigate kind of the decline of moments of, intense rupture and possibility. And naming that there's possibility in those spaces too, right? Like like there's actually things that we can't do if we're just in the street every day. Like we need to take space to like go back to the drawing board and like work on something other than just pushing the revolutionary moment forward.
Yeah, I love that. And like, I want to pop over to Scott, but I also like, that's making me think about, yeah, that series is really good. Like low key, maybe the best thing they've produced. They were really good from like Occupied 2015. That was like, they were really hot right in there. No offense to current, they're still doing lots of cool stuff, I'm sure. And I know, but anyway, like, I think like there is this question around that stuff of like, in those moments, and I think your book really touches on this in a beautiful way, and I think we can really build on this. What makes those moments work is because the conviction that it's going to happen, and no matter how many times you lose, like I've seen some people just get jaded and refuse to have that feeling, and those people, sometimes they stick around, but mostly they leave, right? Mostly they like leave the movement. But people who like really kind of stick around in the movement, like often like access that feeling every time it hits the streets, you know. No matter how big it is, no matter how, and I think maybe not literally like the revolution is really, really going to happen, but so I think like thinking through sort of your book, Scott, like it's about actually like, it's because it is happening. Like in that moment, we are experiencing this different form of time, this different form of life that is the revolution. Like if we think of it in this way, that's not messianic. And so like, I think like, but again, that can be a little corny, and you can reduce that to like, oh, the point is just to be in struggle, or like the sort of bad insurrecto critique, which is like all that matters is being in the streets, which is not helpful either. Or the idea that like there isn't more to win than just the movement itself, like which isn't true either. There's a lot of like questions, right? Like there's a lot of contradictions. But like I think like I just thinking about the falling out of movements is everyone experiences all this despair at the loss of that you're pointing to, liberty, and then they turn on each other. They turn on the people who are close to them because they're actually angry at themselves for not being able to access that anymore, and they're really sad and they're in grief, and grief really fucks with us. We really don't know how to handle it well, and with purpose. We've been trained to not handle it well. We have been our knowledge of grief has been taken from us, right, among many other things. So I think like so getting back to sort of breakup and solution, but also just that thinking about these sort of like everyday practices, like how can we integrate that hope for that feeling, knowing that that feeling is like the prelude to like actually really big change, and also being able to integrate the fact that like it probably won't work because we've felt that way, and feeling that way, millions of people feeling that way hasn't been enough so far. So just to I see the book as sort of sitting in a space. That's why I was thinking of the faggots and their friends between revolutions very similarly. This sort of like between revolution space kind of feeling. How do you see that connecting to a form of like life practice while without falling totally into lifestyle? This is the other cat is not making an appearance. Without falling totally into lifestyleism, whatever, or pure cynicism about the possibility of street action.
I like what both of you are saying. And I mean, one thing just in terms of the book, like I kind of want to demolish the hierarchy of like struggle in the streets over the other work that we do, because I think that's also like macho gendered shit that also like it doesn't distinguish us from certain kinds of communist, Marxist, whatever, authoritarian revolutionaries. But I think you're right, Vicky, like that moment is the revolution, right? We aren't prepared for whatever the next day is in the kind of punctual idea of like a progressive, like we do this thing, we take it over, and then we have it. I was having this conversation for the Final Straw with Mohammed Abdu, and he was talking about his experience in Tahrir Square, and he's like, that which had a horrible violence and failure in that, and the way he was trying to talk about is like we just weren't prepared because we didn't have everything built for whatever is next. And I understand that kind of way of thinking too, that we could like build a kind of infrastructure that would then be ready for that confrontation. But personally, that's not the way that I see it happening. Like I think those moments are important, if only for the experience that you have of the possibilities, and then the bonds that you form that are like kind of indelible after that you like know who your people are. But really it's the experience of possibility. I think that like something can change, and that like that, you know, the police are fallible, that they can be overcome, or but like there's no way, especially in the United States and the way that's set up, that like there's going to be like one thing that pushes it over, right? Because it's like it's pretty much structured for that to not be possible. And so like, yeah, I don't want to place all the value there and like forget the other things that we do. And how can we take that experience, which is one of the most, you know, enlivening experiences that you can have of being in the streets and the struggle, and infuse our other lives with that, and the other parts of our lives, and not think that we're not doing enough, right? Like not become like an insurrecto bro or something. Or simply like, I mean, there's a version of nihilism that my like idea of nihilism is that I want to negate everything that exists. And I think that's good, but like a kind of pessimism that means like, there's no way. I like the pessimism that's like, we need to destroy this world. And we do that however we can. But yeah, so thinking about like that, those two things need to be connected rather than distinguished, because we're not going to have a punctual revolution. We're not ready for it, even if that was something that was like on the verge of happening, which it isn't. More likely what I see happening in terms of, I mean, I'm not going to, I was going to be like, this is what I see happening, but I'm not going to predict things.
No, tell us, I want to hear.
You should do that. We should practice this more. Honestly, like you'll be wrong. It's cool. Like do it.
Well,
Sorry.
thinking about,
Well, if you don't want to, you shouldn't. Sorry for both of us pressuring you, but go for it if you want to.
I mean, there's stuff that I'm thinking about. Well, okay. One of the places for struggle that I think is really important right now is the anti-trans stuff that's going on. Because I think, you know, right after the reversal of Roe, the Dobbs case, we can see that fighting the policies and fighting the laws doesn't work. And it takes up all of our time and effort. That's not the place for it. And I think that there's an opportunity here for a kind of more radical or anarchist trans sort of approach to this, which sort of embodies the fact that there's a moral panic around transness destroying society. And as an anarchist, I'm like, yes, like I want to destroy society. And if transition's the way to do that, then yes, you know. And that's not really giving us like ways to be, but I'm thinking about how that also is indicative of these kinds of enclaves of like sort of Christian fascist strongholds in the United States that people have tried to predict as some sort of proto-civil war happening. I like the sort of, I think that it's probably accurate that if something like that happens, it's going to be like spread out and not some kind of like major civil war, which allows for opening of spaces for coming together and thinking about conflict in a different way with like the fascist forces or the state forces. So again, I think it's not something, it's something that would be disparate and spread out and not punctual. And honestly, like for a kind of anarchist way of thinking about things, that's like more our sort of space, right? To think about things as, you know, hopefully like loosely federated areas, and then and community defense against other spaces that are encroaching on it. Like that's probably more realistic. Also, because of climate is going to make certain spaces accessible and other spaces not. And the work that it would take to kind of totally undo the state form as an actual form of governance, but also the way that it dominates our mind is generations, right? It's like generations of work because of all the trauma and violence that people have lived, and the kind of acculturation that we've done. So I think like, yeah, I don't know if that was coherent at all, but that's sort of where I'm going with these thoughts. Maybe I'll just stop there.
I want to invite folks who are in the audience to type out any questions or prompts that you'd like to hear Scott and Vicky addressing or checking in on. A reminder that Q&A tool is available sort of in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen.
Yeah, I'd love to hear people's thoughts or questions or.
And maybe while we wait for people to type out their questions, I'll kind of throw another question at you or at both of y'all. You know, I think in reading the book, there's a lot of radical practices that are kind of like present in the text that I think we've really seen take off in terms of both like their prevalence and also their like cultural capital in the last few years. So I'm thinking about like mutual aid, workplace organizing and refusals, rioting and looting. And I guess a question I have is sort of, is it sufficient simply to have these practices, or do they need to be embedded in some way in like a consciousness? Like, to put it another way, like, can we get to anarchism simply by like doing anarchy, or is there something further that is necessary in order to kind of like pull it all together in a coherent form?
Yeah, it's interesting because the way that you just said that, I had a new thought about it. But okay, so one thing I think anarchism should allow us to do is to say, wherever people are struggling for good things, which I think an anarchist disposition knows what those things are mostly, that we support that, right? Like, I could say I don't think the revolution is going to happen from workplace organizing, but I'm still going to support people doing that because that's important. And that experience, even if they lose whatever they're looking for, the experience of organizing with your workers is the same kind of experience of being in the streets, right? But I think, I don't know. I don't think that I actually think that it can't be brought together into a coherent structure and still be what I'm thinking about as anarchism, because that totalizing idea, right? The state form, which has played out in terms of capitalist states and socialist states and so-called communist states, verges on fascism and totalitarianism, right? Because of the way that it needs to relate to its inhabitants, which it classifies by those who are included and those who are excluded, through the ideas of like demographics and like monitoring people and surveillance of like people's lives. Like, any kind of totalizing structure is going to reproduce some of those kind of, that sort of top-down power structure that basically disallows individual autonomy or kind of working together, because it has to have everyone in a place. So an anti-state kind of logic for me isn't going to have an ultimate coherence, but like, again, like stringing along all these different things, it's like, it has to be makeshift in a way, right? We have to find the ways to live where we are right now, and then that changes, and then you redo it. I don't know if that ended up vague, but yeah, that's sort of my thinking.
No, and I was, do you want to hop on, Liberty? I didn't want to.
Oh, I was gonna like provide maybe also a concrete example of like where I feel like maybe this becomes like challenging, right? Is a situation like, I think back to Occupy, when you had like a mass movement where people were like, it's all these people, they're not anarchists, but they're doing anarchism. That was like the buzz, right? For Occupy was like, it doesn't matter if they're anarchists, they're doing anarchism. But like, actually, in retrospect, we're like, oh, there were a lot of like limitations placed on the movement because people were doing anarchism without the like underlying consciousness, right? And so you ended up with these like extremely dysfunctional spaces. And so I do think there are like maybe some constraints on what can be achieved, like if it's just a series of practices.
To speak to that example, sorry, go ahead, Scott.
No, you go.
Yeah, like I think that's really important, because I also like I'm a little younger, like, so I came up during Occupy. That was like my first sort of like big radicalizing moment for me, and like I have a lot of friends for whom that's also true, right? And I think like the way that I was going to answer even your previous question, Liberty, and speak to that is that, and also to Scott, your idea of failure here, I think, which is really important, is like, a lot of us learned how to do it through Occupy. Unfortunately, that meant that Occupy was a fucking mess. A lot of people got treated badly. It burnt out really well. For example, like we should have, like the autonomous and anti-authoritarians in New York should have figured out that there was so much money going through the GA that we should have like made a fake caucus just to like get some of that money and build things. That'll never happen again now, because like everyone learned that lesson, right? So like we didn't, but like, like I think there's sort of like this idea of and now every movement I've ever been part of has a class, a very small class of like kind of grifters who like organize the money and make off with a bunch of it. It always happens. Like, it's very impressive, you know. Some people really learned that lesson from Occupy. But I think more than just sort of saying it provocatively. I think and maybe those people are doing cool shit with it. I don't know what they're doing with the money. Maybe they're doing great work with it. I don't know. But I think the question of consciousness for me has always been one that I find very old school, very unsatisfying in a way, even though I experience it and I know it's real. For example, I know for a fact that my understanding of white supremacy in America was wildly insufficient until the Troy Davis movement, and then more importantly, like Ferguson, the post-Ferguson movement. And it's still insufficient, but it forced me to like really take it seriously in a way that like I hadn't centralized it before, right? Like but I thought I had, right? I thought I understood it well and had studied it. And, like the way in which like these things expand what we recognize that we need to think about and the questions that we need to answer. Like, I think the only real danger of those failures is if we don't ask the questions. If we end up just, if the generation completely like, is like discontinuous. Like, one thing I've been thinking about a lot lately is part of the reason, because like the 70s through the early 2000s, or excuse me, through the entire first decade of the 2000s, like, is one of the greatest periods of social quiet in the history of capitalism, actually. Now, obviously, that's if you're only looking at the non-socialist world. There are massive social revolutions all across that and much of the post-colonial world, and you still have uprisings like LA. But in general, there's sort of this loss of consciousness. And I wonder, like, this is going to sound really maybe almost conspiratorial, but like that has a lot to do with AIDS, right? And like the like whole generations of people literally died with that knowledge, that embodied knowledge that they had gained from movement. And I think like, and if you look at a place like Indonesia, where there was a particularly successful genocide on the left, or China in the 20s, often then those things really disappear, because it's the embodied learning of that knowledge and holding it into the next wave of movement and the next wave of action that, for me, promises the possibility of further consciousness. So like every wave that fails, we've also had more people like learn what to do. And yeah, people drop out every time, but like largely, I don't want to fall too much into a progress myth, but like the waves have been bigger and closer together. Like the pandemic has really put a halt for here in the US in a way that hasn't really happened over the last decade, I guess. So I'm just going to sort of jump back to Scott, because I think your book sort of speaks to some of this too, that like, if we're thinking of the movement as the thing, then like Occupy was really important because it was reintroducing people to trying to answer those questions. But obviously they were going to do a really bad job answering those questions the first time out of the gate, and yeah, there were definite limits that were based in the sort of populism and consensus stuff that were just no good. The whiteness, the middle class, the fallen middle class. There's a lot of problems with Occupy. Anyway, I don't know. These are all rambling thoughts. I'm gonna bump over to you, Scott. So now you can ramble at me. That's not a question, but good luck.
No, I mean, yeah. So I agree with what you're saying, Vicky. I think something's happening, right? Like over the last decade or so, worldwide, and that's important. Which is also why, like, I wanted to write a book like this. I never was like, I'm gonna write a book on anarchism. That was never like something that I thought I was going to do. But when I was given an opportunity, because it was like of interest, I was like, oh, I have a lot of thoughts on this. And I think there's a moment to seize, right? And to like get people interested in, I'm going to do it differently than some of the books from like 10 years ago or whatever, or 20 years ago or 50 years ago, whatever. So, and that, I think that speaks to the kind of consciousness idea too, like, disidentification. It could be another word of like, demystifying, and the kind of Hegelian or Marxist idea of like getting outside of ideology, if that such a thing exists, or forming a kind of anarchist ideology, or like a way, like I'm saying, I like Cindy Milstein's idea of like the ethical compass. I think that that's a really helpful way of thinking about it too, because it's like a way of gauging actions rather than predetermining them. But I do think that it does produce a kind of consciousness of like, and that's what I'm trying to build up in the book, like, okay, these are all the things around me. I can engage with them in a variety of ways. What if I try to engage in each instance of my life in a way that like promotes, collective freedom, right? Like my freedom at the limit of someone else's, or mutual responsibility, or whatever, however you want to call it, right? you can think about it in that kind of minuscule way. You know, so like the failures of Occupy, like obviously that was important, right? And it happened in a string of things around the world but like people were trying things out that they didn't know, or like there were people who were doing anarchist processes but didn't have a commitment to anarchism, right? Like, you know, they had other commitments, or there wasn't enough like unplugging from like from thinking that there's some kind of top-down solution to these things, right? Like this was still in the Obama era, right? Where people maybe were still thinking that the state could help them. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I don't need to make a bunch of pronouncements on Occupy, but like, you know, if you compare Occupy to the George Floyd uprisings, like it does seem generationally or whatever that something has shifted and some better things have happened. And I think the pandemic actually is part of that, even though it's halted things, it's also created opportunities. So yeah, so yes, I think that a consciousness is sort of important, however we want to define it. But for me, it's like thinking about like ways of doing things rather than the answers of how they have to be done.
Yeah, and just in the Q&A. Vicky, why don't you finish your thought?
Do a really quick clarify. The idea that I think is old-fashioned is false consciousness. Whenever someone brings up false consciousness, I'm like, dog, no.
Yeah.
Thinking about how we're thinking, very important. The idea that like you can break, I think that's like a individual psychologized internalization of the messianic revolution, right? We're going to break with false consciousness once and for all. Not going to happen that way. Okay.
So yeah, we've got several questions in the Q&A, and I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but let's jump in on a couple of them. WM is sharing some reflections, but also ends up asking this question about personalities hijacking anarchist projects, spaces, movements, and kind of, I guess, how do we create those spaces, have them endure for whatever duration, you know, they are necessary. And, you know, there's some examples in this question, kind of, you know, providing food, shelter, healthcare. So I think there's certainly a mutual aid focus here, but I think anything, yeah, this question of, we haven't really talked about this, but personalities hijacking.
Yeah, that's real. Okay, so on the breakup side of things, I'm like, this idea of like, so you want to have a project that continues, but the people who are involved in that project can change, right? Which is also helpful just for burnout, because people get that kind of, either you get like a martyr complex, or you just don't bring people in, so it's all falling on like one or two people or three people or whatever. So I think that is a way of like, you gotta switch people out so people don't maintain the specific roles all the time. This is another lesson in the dispossessed, right? Like if you have a certain position, then you start identifying with that position. I think this is also the way I try to talk about our work. Like we can't identify with the job that we do. And I think that translates to our organizing work too. Personalities, I mean, that's tricky. You know, when I've encountered a situation where I'm organizing and I clash with a personality, that's I'm a person who will engage in conflict in what I hope is a productive way. And then if it can't be resolved, then I'm like, well, this isn't the place for me, you know? And I think often you're not going to be the only one who's like, this personality is taking something over and kind of ruining it, right? And so you can splinter off, right? I mean, that's something the left is actually really good at, is splintering. Let's use that as a strength rather than the idea that we're like messing up when we do that. You know, it's like you just like let that person keep doing the thing, and then everyone else kind of go over there. That's just, yeah, my thought about like my sort of encounters with that.
And like, just like for an example, now that we're talking about, you know, sort of Occupy, like an example of that, when Occupy, the original meetings got called like August 2nd before anything had happened in New York, Workers' World showed up, who's one of those party forums. I think they're still probably strong in New York, if they're not strong anywhere else, is my understanding. Maybe they are, I don't know, don't really care. But they had come with a speaker and with like a speaker system and a microphone. We're talking, but the call had been for a General Assembly on October 2nd. And what happened was a bunch of us, like, I had just been in Spain just by total chance during the Acampado movement. There was someone who had been in Greece during the riots and the movement there, the movement of the squares there. David Graeber is actually one of them. And a bunch of us just like went and sat in a circle down the way in the park, not just out of range so we could talk without being drowned out by their speakers. It's all we did. And it was like 10 of us. And then it was everyone. And then eventually the workers' world people showed up and started yelling at us as like deviationists or whatever. I don't remember. But at that point it was too late. We formed working groups, and like that was like sort of the germ of Occupy, right? It was precisely this moment of like, okay, here's this form that these people rely on. They know it works. And a bunch of people were just like, like that's not really what we came here for. But like, we're not going to just complain and leave. We're going to go do the thing we want to do, right? That's not always going to work. It's not always going to happen that way. But I think it's a really good example. And then that obviously turned into Occupy Wall Street, which is this huge national movement that we're still talking about 12 years later. At least the three of us are. I don't know how many people are, but I think so these questions that I think are really valuable in the book is a disposition towards acting immediately on, or maybe not immediately in like an irresponsible way, but like immediately in like a controlled, respectful, like careful way, but like immediately on the things that in the present. And I think the reason breakups is a really powerful metaphor for me is because I have a tendency to want to really work on a relationship. Like, it's like, no, like even like a friendship, like we don't do a lot of friendship breakups, right? It's like, no, we're going to make this work. Like we have all this history. We cared about each other for so long. Like it's not working now. And like, just like having a disposition towards like, actually, like this isn't serving us. Like maybe in 10 years we'll want to reconnect, but like we should stop, and that, and the thing that's hard about a breakup is accepting that often, I found. It's not like both parties know it's moving towards that, but no one is willing to accept it. And like a disposition towards accepting it, I think, obviously that's purely relationship talk, but like I think like that also can affect these sort of like political practices in a way of like really thinking about orienting around that. And I think that the problem of personalities is a real one also in that like a more recent example, and then I'll shut up. But in 2020 in Philly, one of the big results of the uprising was this very successful unhoused movement that was largely started by people squatting buildings. But there was a big encampment down sort of in central downtown, one of the central areas of Philly. And that encampment quickly got taken over by precisely the kind of personalities, activist personalities, bureaucracies. It became a very unworkable place, and a lot of people left. But luckily there were these organizers there who were really like about it, and they just started a new camp further north in one of the neighborhoods more devastated by identification. That camp was smaller, but it actually occupied more strategically core ground, and ended up being a really crucial part in winning the demands that were won. And I think if those people had stayed in the main camp and fought it out, I think nothing would have come of it. And an ugly thing that happened is that the people who did stay in the main camp and fought it out and controlled that space blamed everyone in the new camp as like sellouts who had like ruined the movement or whatever. It's just, there was drama. It wasn't clean. It wasn't nice. People weren't really friends at the end of it. So I don't want to pretend it was this huge success, but like there were 60 houses that the city and the housing development gave up to put unhoused people in. That is run by Land Trust now. So like these sort of like the idea of like expanding an attack to a different register, to literally a different camp or a different space. Expanding doesn't mean the numbers get bigger. Expanding can mean, and there's that constantly quoted thing from the counterinsurgency manual, right? Police can easily handle one crowd of 10,000 people. Police can't handle 10 crowds of 1,000 people, right? Like you just can't do it. Not to be totally like swarm mentality or whatever, like therefore what we have to do is, but I think like, but there's truth there too, that the more we centralize our attentions, our focuses, our desires into the future, the more we centralize those things, the harder it becomes to overcome the problem, like particularly charismatic, but difficult personalities. But if we are able to split away, then it doesn't matter.
I think, and like, that was an amazing example. And like, just to bring it back to like the kind of like disposition towards revolution, like there's still this idea that we need a massive revolution, like that it needs to be popular, like the working class or whatever that like needs to support it. And I just don't think that's like, that's not gonna happen. People aren't the anarchism also knows that people aren't all gonna agree on something, right? Like we have to factor that into our strategy. And really, like, that's why I focus on anarchism as a way of doing, because like the thing that's convincing to people is when you do things that are cool and that they like, and right, rather than be like, I have this idea of how you should actually think about your world. So yeah, like breaking off and doing something and trying it out, and rather that takes some kind of risk, because you're removing yourself from what seems to be the bigger group, which we think is going to be the one that wins something. But then doing that allows people to experiment and try something new, and then actually live some kind of anarchist experience rather than the getting stuck in the protest model.
Yeah,
I want to throw us one
Yeah,
more
yeah.
question here from the okay, this is a question from Carrie, which I'm going to reframe as a work of speculative fiction. All right, Scott,
Yeah.
6 months from now, you're at an anarchist book fair. It's incredible. There's 2 to 3 times more people there than were predicted. People are so enthused. It's old people who have been in the movement a long time showing up with new energy. It's young people who it's their first anarchist book fair. And you walk up to a particularly busy table and you pick up a fresh zine you've never seen before, and your name is on it. And you're overcome with joy because you realize that someone has copied a chapter out of your book and republished it as a zine. They didn't get your permission. They just did it. And it's your favorite section of the book. What section is it?
I mean, I hope that happens. Yeah, people can reproduce stuff as much as they want. So I think the relationships chapter contains a lot of the kernels of like all the other things. It's the place of breakup, and that's really, for me, like the sort of building block, even though it's an unbuilding block, to think about all the other things. So I think that would be it. And I think it also, like, because I was thinking about the chapters at the end about like time or whatever, the little more like wooey abstract stuff, which is where my head likes to go. But I think the relationship chapter has all that, and it's practical in a way. And then thinking about how that can be applied to other situations that aren't just interpersonal relationships. Plus it talks about like kids and stuff too, which I think is really important. So yeah, I think it's the second chapter. Are relationships even possible? Anarchy at home.
That was a great section. Yeah, I agree. Okay, we're kind of close to the end of our time. We got maybe a softball question for you from the Q&A. Stella is wondering, how old were you when you knew you were an anarchist?
I mean, okay, so I think like kids are anarchists and then are like trained into submission through parenting in school and whatever. So I was always anti-authoritarian. But when I used that word for myself, probably came when I was like 13 and I got into punk, and I saw like the Sex Pistols, and then went into Revolution Books, which is actually like it was, yeah, right, it's like a authoritarian communist, I think. Is it? I don't know if it's I don't remember.
It's RCP. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, it's RCP. Yeah. But I found this book on anarchism. Oh, it's actually about punk and anarchism. It was called
What
The Philosophy
was that
of
doing
Punk.
there?
It was an AK Press book, and a 90s AK Press book, The Philosophy of Punk. It was this guy's dissertation, and I was like, oh yeah, this explains why I like punk, and it explains how I think about everything else. So that was when I first like put words to it. But like, yeah, just like when you're told what to do and you're like, no, like that for me as a kid was like, yeah, I talked back a lot. So I don't know, Stella, you're probably already an anarchist if you think about it.
Yeah, if you have to ask, it's like when people are like, how do it, like, I don't know if I've always thought I'm queer. I'm like, honey, you're definitely queer. If you're asking.
Oh, I mean,
just people never ask, are they trans enough to transition? Just like heads up if that applies to you in the but yeah, embarrassingly, like for me, it's 18, but it's like literally the same shit. Like I was in punk scenes. I read books about punk. I read Grail Marcus's Lipstick Traces, which is like a book connecting like Dadaism and situationism, Guy Debord, and punk. And I was like, and like then I like picked up I think, Society of the Spectacle, didn't understand a word of it, and was like, that's it, I'm an anarchist, like this is totally it, even though I don't understand anything in this book. And even though Guy Debord's not really an anarchist, whatever. So yeah, so I think it was probably like 18 or 19 for me when I started calling myself that.
I love that connection to queerness, because at the same time period, I was like, am I gay? It's just like, I don't know how to figure this out. Yeah.
Closing thoughts on the book. I think we're how old were you? How old were you, Liberty? How old
yeah,
were
Liberty,
you didn't answer.
It was actually today. It was on the way. It was on the way.
Did you read this book?
I had an epiphany. I was reflecting on an incredible book which I had an opportunity to read.
I knew you were I always knew you were one though.
Okay, no.
So 19, in other words, 19.
Real answer, yeah, I was probably like 16 or 17. I think I literally wrote a report on anarchism like during my second year in high school. And like while I was writing the report, I was like Google searching. There was no Google. Who am I kidding? I was doing whatever you did before Google search. I don't even remember. And I remember finding the anarchist FAQ. No one has ever been radicalized by the anarchist FAQ, but it was a pretty good find.
Amazing. I love that.
Does it still exist?
Oh yeah, totally. And it was published by AK as like a 2-volume set. It's massive.
Oh, I thought you were talking about like an old website.
Oh, it was. I mean, it was.
Oh.
It existed as a like collaborative like online FAQ, which I think was started like as a result of like fights between like anarchists and like anarcho-capitalists or something. I don't know. Whatever. It's a massive resource, and it was citable for a high school essay. I could have a better answer than that, but I think we're out of time. It's been really awesome, and I really appreciate everybody for coming out. If you haven't already, I want to encourage you to grab a copy of Scott's book. I did just drop a link to it, as well as In Defense of Looting. Really great book as well. You should definitely pick it up. That's in the chat.
So good.
Yeah.
I love In Defense of Looting.
Thanks,
Scott. You should
Cool.
read it.
It's been awesome.
My publisher, oh, sorry. It's still just hardcover though, but it's for free on Anarchist Library. So if you prefer a really expensive book, you can find it for sure.
Cool. All right, y'all. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Thanks
so
everyone.
much.